We're so happy to see you all here. It's always nice to have families in the audience as well. It is my pleasure to introduce you to today's guest speaker, a dear colleague and a friend of ours that we've known over many, many years. Fresh from the college fair, I'd like to introduce Mr. Stephen Abbott, who serves as the Associate Director of Admissions and Coordinator of Native Recruitment at Dartmouth College. Stephen has over 20 years of distinguished service in our profession, and he is just a real pleasure to work with, not only because he's so knowledgeable and he's really compassionate with the families he works with, but he also is, he really dedicates himself to serving students and their families in a really authentic and accessible way. We're just so thankful that he was willing to come all this way to meet with us for Ohana Days. So please join me in giving a warm welcome to Stephen Abbott.
Great. Good afternoon, everyone. You hear me okay? Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much. And thank you to Cindy and Andrew and the entire team here at HPA. It is a real honor and very humbling to be here. I feel like they must have told you this was like a 1 o'clock performance of Hamilton or something, so you may be a little disappointed, but what we'd like to do over the next however much time we have is just to pull the curtain back a little bit on this process, and I'm going to be talking much more generally about college admissions and preparing good application, finding fit, all of those different kinds of things, just from our perspective and from sort of the other side of this. So would really like to take the time as much as possible to, again, kind of illuminate things a little bit. I think there's a lot of as much misinformation as information out there these days around the college application process, the college search process. And so I hope that the information that we'll have to share with you today will be valuable, that will be helpful, and if anything, hopefully reduce the stress and anxiety levels a little bit around this process and everything else. So, and I always like to bust a few myths along the way and share whatever we can to just provide good, solid information wherever you might be looking and considering for your college and university goals. So I always like to start with just kind of acknowledging the fact that this is a really stressful and difficult process in many ways, and it can be very, very confusing. As I said, there's so much misinformation out there, and there's so much buzz and static and everything else that goes on in this process that it can really be difficult to kind of get to the core of what's most important. What do I really need to do? What is this process really all about? What are my best options? All those different kinds of things. And so every generation of students, I feel like every year of students, you guys face a little bit more. There's more on Reddit, there's more articles, there's more stuff happening in different chat groups and everything else. And so I feel for you, and like I say, I hope, if anything, we can just provide some good information for you that will be helpful as you're navigating through this process. So one of the first things that we always like to talk about when we're thinking about college admissions is thinking about fit. So for those of you who don't know, there are over 4,000 different colleges and universities out there just in the United States alone. And so trying to pick out among 4,000 which are the few that you might want to apply to and which one you would ultimately like to go to is no small part of this process. And so, there's all these different factors that we can consider in the process, and everything from the size of the institution, the location, the geography, the type of institution, all of these different kinds of things that determine what might be the best fit for you as a student, for your goals, and all those different kinds of things. And so this is just sort of a general list of some of the things that people can consider as you're, wading your way through those 4,000 different colleges and universities. So what are these applications really all about? That's sort of at the core of the process, and that's what we'd like to really spend the majority of this afternoon talking about. And I want to start with just the types of institutions and the type of admissions processes that go on with different colleges and universities. Not the least confusing part of all of this is that every institution is a little bit different. And every type of institution is a little bit different. And just to make it really fun, even the same institutions from year to year can be really different. So one of the things that is tremendously annoying about us as admissions officers as a species is anytime you ask a question, we tend to answer with, it depends. So, and it really does depend on the specific institution and the specific student and all those different kinds of things. And this is ultimately a highly personalized process. But essentially, there are three types of enrollment or application processes that go on in colleges and universities. This is obviously very broadly defined, but there's open enrollment, pretty self-explanatory, and that simply means that for whatever reason and whatever way, the school basically all you have to do is sign up and you go. Then there's what is called threshold-based, or sometimes referred to as bright line admissions, and there's no real official title for it, but basically a school is giving you a target, a finish line. If you have this GPA, if you have this test score, you have this combination, you have these prerequisites, you're going to get in. And then there are the schools that you tend to hear about the most in the news and the ones that tend to generate some of the most traffic and talked about and everything else, which are the selective and highly selective institutions. And those are selective institutions generally are schools that are accepting 50% or less of the students who apply. In most cases, it's not because they want to, it's simply because we get far more applications than we actually have space for, and far more amazing applications than we have seats for in the class. So the good news is that if you're looking at those first two categories, open enrollment and threshold-based admissions, that accounts for somewhere around 85 to 90% of the schools in the country. There are very few colleges that fall into this selective and highly selective category, and so most schools are pretty open about this is what you need to do to get in. One of the reasons that we wanted to focus on the selective and highly selective institutions today is not just because that's the type of institution that I represent, but also if you're preparing an application that is for this type of institution, you're going to be pretty much golden for anything else that you're considering, including a lot of competitive scholarships and things like that. So these institutions, for the most part, use what we call a holistic application review. So what is holistic admissions or holistic review? Pretty much self-explanatory, once again. So holistic review simply means we're not just looking at the numbers. We don't give you a GPA or a test score target that you have to have in order to be admitted or in order to be considered. We look at everything that's in your application. So as much as anything, we're actually building a community every year. And so we are looking at not just your grades and test scores, but we're looking at what your counselors say about you. We're looking at what your teachers say about you. We're looking at the things that define you outside the classroom. So what are you involved in terms of extracurriculars or athletics at your school, but also things you might do in your community, things that you might do in your family, things that you say about yourself, your own voice, your dreams, your hopes, your interests, your passions are really, really important in this process as well. So all of these different things go into holistic review. So it's not just take a GPA, take a test score, add it together, divide by 2, and you get in or you don't. So we are really looking at everything in this process. So ultimately, we are trying to get to know you through this process. We are trying to get to find out in a few short pages. I know it doesn't feel like a few short pages when you're typing all that stuff out, but for us in reviewing it and trying to get to know who you are, it is a few short pages. So we're really trying to get a sense of where are you going to be on our campus? What type of person are you going to be? What are you going to be like as someone's roommate? What are you going to be like as someone's floor mate? What are you going to be like as a teammate, a peer in a classroom, those different kinds of things. So that's why your voice is so important. So you do want to find ways to stand out in this process, and I'm going to come back to that in a moment. So we are looking at students who stand out among their peers, but we're always also looking at you in context. So one of the most common questions I get, and one of the most difficult questions that we get every single day is, what makes a student stand out? And unfortunately, there isn't a real easy answer for that because every student stands out in a different way and for different reasons. So it really is about you telling your story and you being who you are and true to your own passions, your own voice, your own worldview. So as cliche and horribly unhelpful as it sounds, being yourself, being honest, being authentic in this process is really what it's all about. So again, ultimately, it is about storytelling. So I said that you want to find ways to stand out. And you want to find ways to stand out, true. But one of the most frequently used phrases I hear is that, oh, we're we're looking for what makes you unique. We're looking for, you have to be unique to get into these selective and highly selective colleges. How many people have heard some version of that? Just show of hands. Most people? Okay, great. How many people would say they think that's true? You have to be unique. A few hands up. How many people don't think that's true? Few people. Okay, great. So we've got a split room. So I always say uniqueness shouldn't really be your goal. There are only, there are about 30,000 applications to Dartmouth every year. Like I say, there's about 14 or 16 pages of information that go into that. Most of those 30,000 applicants are about the same age. Most have had similar experiences in high school. The ability to truly be unique in that process is not easy. And in my personal opinion, it really shouldn't be the goal either, because the more people focus on trying to be unique, the more you can start standing out for really oddball reasons and things that might not actually be great, and also things that ultimately are not as reflective of you. So again, to me, this is much more a process of authenticity than worrying about trying to be unique. It's a wonderful quote from Walt Disney. And this really cuts to the heart of the matter. The more that you're like yourself, the more that you like yourself, the less you're going to sound like everybody else. And that's really what ultimately does make you unique in this process. So again, it's kind of cliche, it's kind of unhelpful, but ultimately that is what the process is all about. So I always say, don't focus on being unique, focus on being you, and that will guide you a lot more authentically through this process. So what are colleges really looking at? Okay, so ultimately this is kind of a very general list of what most schools in general are looking at, and certainly what most of the selective schools are looking at. So the first one is academic preparation. You'll notice we don't say intelligence, we don't say smart. You won't hear us use a phrase like that. We are really looking at preparation. So there's a lot of people who are the preparation is to make sure that you are going to be able to come to our campus, to our curriculum, to our school, and be able to do well. That's our first responsibility as admissions officers. So obviously, we hope you're smart. The vast majority of our applicant pool is extremely smart, extremely intelligent, but we also want to make sure that you've had access to the preparation that's going to help you do well at our school. And that runs the full spectrum from your grades to the types of classes that you've taken. Some schools are back to requiring testing, some are still test optional. Testing is everybody's favorite topic. We can come back to that later if people want to. But general, we're looking at what kind of academic preparation have you had. Then we're gonna be looking at your extracurricular involvement. And again, really important to remember that extracurricular involvement is not just the things that you do at school, but it's also things that you do in a faith community. It's also things you might do at home, in your community, family responsibilities that you have, all of those different things that take up your time, that take up your priorities when you're not in school, when you're not studying. Diversity, voice, impact. What is your worldview? Where are you coming from? What do you represent? What are you going to contribute? So a place like Dartmouth, most of our classes are going to be really small. It's about 20 students or less. This would be unheard of for a Dartmouth class. So most of the classes are going to be very interactive. We want students to have the opportunity to learn from one another. So being able to identify your own voice, share what kind of priorities you have, all those different kinds of things are really important and something that we're trying to capture through that application process. Obviously, your personal characteristics, things like that. And as I've said, we're ultimately trying to build a community. So it's partly about you as an individual. It's also ultimately about what are you bringing to this collective community. So again, storytelling is really the emphasis that that I like to place, because this is really about your opportunity through the application to tell us a little bit more about who you are. So what actually goes into the application? Again, most of you, particularly the seniors who are already carving their way through this process, know all this. These are the types of things that you're going to find in most applications, whether they're institutional applications, whether it's a common application, QuestBridge, all the different vehicles that you might use for the application itself. So we're going to be talking a lot about your personal and demographic information. You're going to be talking about your academics, your all the different things that you've been, awards, citations, all that sort of thing, your extracurricular activity. You're going to include your transcript or your school report. That'll come directly from the school. Your scores, again, different institutions are going to be at different places on that. And then your letters of recommendation, possibly an interview, and possibly supplemental materials. and we'll break each of these down a little bit as we go through. So I already mentioned a little bit about the academic preparation, but again, we are looking at your grades, but it's not just that, so often we get, well, do you look at weighted GPA or do you look at unweighted GPA? Which one is more important? And it really is going to depend. There's that word again. It's going to depend on what your school reports and what kind of basic information that we have from the school. So it's not just a numbers game of, a 4.08 is better than a 3.98 or a 3.0 is worse than a 4.0 or anything else. Once again, we're looking at you in context. What have you had access to? What is your school doing? How are you doing in relation to that school? So we obviously love to see upward trends. So sometimes when you first get to a school, transitioning can be difficult. First year can be difficult. So oftentimes we'll get students who don't start off all that strong and then work their way up. We have students who do extremely well all the way through. We have students who may go up and down a little bit. It depends. But overall, upward trends and consistency are great. Downward trends, a little bit tougher, but sometimes there's reasons for that. Sometimes you might be jumping into a more challenging curriculum. Sometimes you may have had things going on at home. So all those things, once again, are things that we're going to look at in context. So we generally like to see students making sure that you've had 4 years of the core subjects. So English, a social studies or social science, lab science or physical science, mathematics, and then some schools will also want to see 2 to 3 years of a foreign language or non-English language. But your different types of classes like art and other electives that you might take are also really important. So sometimes people think it's only about core classes, but again, this is about you and your journeys. So if you're a really passionate artist, those art classes can be really important, or a recommendation from an art teacher can be really important. So again, very much a personalized part of that journey. Extracurriculars, again, so many different things that students are involved with. It's not necessarily about volume when it comes to extracurriculars. It's about commitment. It's about passion. It's about what takes up your time and what your priorities are. So another myth that I often hear people talking about is that, you have to have a certain amount of this and a certain amount of this and a certain amount of this. And if you don't have volunteer experience or you don't have a part-time job or you don't have leadership experience or you don't have at least one varsity sport, those kinds of things, they're not going to look at you. The reality is everybody's path is going to be different. Everybody's priorities are going to be different. If you're working 25 or 30 hours a week to help buy your own clothes and pay for your books and help support your family, you don't have time to play 2 varsity sports. If you're playing 2 varsity sports, you probably don't have time to work 25 or 30 hours a week. If you are involved in your student government and a whole bunch of organizations on campus, you may not have a lot of time to get out there and volunteer in the community. If you're taking care of brothers and sisters at home, you may not have time to do all those different extracurricular activities. So every single path is different, every student is different. So the extracurricular list is very much yours to own and yours to talk about according to whatever your priorities are. So I really do encourage, as I said earlier, to remember to think outside of just school activities and to remember that this is everything that takes up your time, but also to remember that this is no one particular formula. It's not a certain amount of community service, a certain amount of athletics, a certain amount of part-time job, and a certain amount of clubs and organizations. It is wide open to whatever you are most interested in. So, myth or reality? You need to be well-rounded to get into college. How many people have heard that one? Most of you. Okay, how many people think, well, you have to be well-rounded to get into college? Few people. Okay. How many people don't think you need to be well-rounded to get into college? I think we have more people on the not well-rounded side. Okay, great. Well, I would certainly say, no, you don't have to be well-rounded. I think well-rounded is a term that suffers a little bit from overuse. Don't get me wrong, well-rounded is great. We love to see students with a lot of different interests. We love to see people who are involved in different things and all those kinds of things. That's great. We also love to see students with a particular passion. So we always say well-rounded is good, pointy is good. Pointy being the opposite of well-rounded, very witty, I know. But pointy is perfectly fine. If you have a real passion for music, you don't need to run out and join the soccer team and the school newspaper in order to sound well-rounded. So the biggest thing is being able to talk about what's important to you, being able to talk about the things that you do. So, for example, if you are really into music and you play music for the school and you play in a local orchestra as well, and you play in a band on the weekends, and you do music camp during the summer times, and you tutor at a local elementary school for music, that's great, okay? Those are all different kinds of things that you can talk about. And just because they're all music doesn't mean that you're less interesting to these schools. The place where pointy can go a little bit awry is when you're not really fleshing that commitment out. And I'll give you an actual example of a student that I read a couple of years ago. And so this young man was captain of his football, or not captain, he was a player on his football team. And he wrote his essay about football. His extracurricular list consisted of two things, which was playing football and being the assistant to the coach in football. His recommendation came from his football coach. So by the end of the application, I knew he played football. I didn't know much else about him. We're a diverse Division I school for our varsity teams, so he wasn't actually a football recruit. So I was like, I know one thing about you, which is you play football, and I don't even know if you're going to do that at our school. So that was a case where I think he really sold himself short, because obviously there's a lot more to him than just playing football. It was very clear that that was a passion for him, but he really wasn't doing a great job of fleshing that out and sharing more about why this path was his, or how that might kind of resonate as he came to Dartmouth. So say the pointier you are, the more you're going to want to explain those points, but there's absolutely nothing wrong with having singular interests. So the college essay, everybody's favorite topic and everybody's favorite project. So most application processes and most of the scholarship applications will ask you to write some sort of personal statement or some sort of essay. And this is where a lot of people get tripped up, or at least get intimidated. And I think most people get intimidated for one of two main reasons. The first is that somehow they think you need to enclose your entire biography in 650 words or less, which hopefully you can't do. Second is that somehow this has to be an incredibly illuminating masterwork of American literature that is going to resonate through the ages, and if you don't have that, Princeton just isn't going to be interested. So the reality is, this is an opportunity. If you look at all the other stuff that goes into your application, so your grades and transcripts, your test scores, your activity list, your letters of recommendation, all the other things that flesh out your application, vast majority of those are either coming from somebody else or things that, at least by the time you sit down to do your applications, you can't control. So your essay is the biggest opportunity you have in your application to really bring out your voice. So this is a piece of formal writing. It doesn't mean it has to be stiff. We just don't want a text or a tweet. But this is your opportunity to really develop your voice. So we always say, if you're a funny person, it's okay to be funny in your application or in your essay. If you're not funny, probably not the time to debut. If you're a deeply philosophical and introspective person, you can be deeply philosophical and introspective. So it's really about your voice and sharing that piece of yourself. Starting on an essay can be the hardest part of it, because you're like, oh, this is the chance to share my voice. How do I share my voice? Where do I go? What do I do with this? So starting with the brainstorming, free writing, everybody's process is a little bit different, but sometimes just putting stuff down on screen, putting stuff down on paper will start to give you a little bit of a sense of what's going to be important to you or what might resonate for you as a topic. So a few things about having read many, many thousands of essays in many different contexts over an almost 30-year career at this point. Lots of different things that I can say about different essays and different personal statements. Majority of them will fall into these categories. They're usually pretty simple. Most people think that you really have to get something that's really complex, or something that's really, again, unique, or something that really kind of unravels the mysteries of the universe, or something along those lines. Most personal statements, really straightforward, really simple. Something answering the question that's asked. It's kind of a duh one, but believe it or not, you'd be amazed how often we read really great essays that have absolutely nothing to do with what we asked. So most times, scholarships, colleges are asking different questions for specific reasons. There's information we want to get out of that. So make sure you're tailoring whatever you're writing to the specific prompt. Self-revelation, the absolute key. That's what this whole process is about. Again, storytelling, it's about you. It's one of the few times in your life you really get to say, it's all about you. And sometimes essay prompts are not necessarily easily designed to get at that information or to get at that self-revelation. So one of the common application prompts many years ago was, tell us about a person you admire. And that was always a really tough one, and a lot of scholarships and other places still use that prompt or still use something like it. Difficult thing with that one was really is about what it is in that person that resonates with you. What about their life, what about their experience is relevant to you? Because oftentimes we would get somebody writing about Auntie and how amazing Auntie is and how powerful she is and all the great things that Auntie did. And by the time we get to the end of the essay, we're ready to admit Auntie, but we don't know anything about you. And Auntie don't want to go back to college. So again, finding those ways to tie things back to you is really important. Your voice, your personality, authenticity, again, critical to all of this. The other thing about each part of the application, and perhaps the essay most of all, is that each part of the application is your opportunity to share something new. So if you've already told us about your commitment to soccer or service or working in the environment, taking care of the Aina, that's great. You don't have to necessarily do your essay on that. If there's more that you want to elucidate with that, great. By all means, feel free. But at every institution, you're always going to have the same person reading your entire application, or at most, two people sitting together reading your application together. So you don't have to repeat things that are already present in your application because we're already going to know those things. So ultimately, we encourage people to think about this as a snapshot. So again, it's not going to be your entire biography. It's not going to be your entire worldview, but it's that one Snapchat-y, TikTok-y kind of moment that is going to give us a little bit of insight, a little bit of a window into who you are, how you think, what your voice is. So some particular experience, observation, those kinds of things. This is always a great question. So how many people have been told, read, heard that there are certain things that you shouldn't talk about in your essays? Okay, great. What are some of the things that, if anybody's willing to just shout out, what are some of the things that you've heard you shouldn't talk about in an essay? Yeah. Divorce, okay. Anyone, go ahead and shout out. Politics, okay. Religion. Sports injuries. Anything else? Those are some of the big ones I hear, too. So how many people think that there are just certain topics that should be off the table? Y'all are getting a little cagey about answering these now. All right. So different people are going to respond in different ways about this. I will just share my own opinion on this. I don't believe that there are things that you shouldn't talk about. Your essay is your essay. This is your opportunity to share with college admissions committees, scholarship reviews, whomever, who you are and what you're about. So if politics isn't really important to you, totally fine. If your religion is important to you, totally fine. If recovering from that sports injury is really important to you, totally fine. The two reasons that you hear most often that some topics are off the table are either A, because you might alienate somebody on the other end, a reader, or B, because they're really common. So those are not necessarily bad things to keep in mind if you are approaching those topics. So, for example, if you're writing your essay about a sports injury, sports injuries are real, and they can be really traumatic. They can change the course of your education. They can change the course of your life. Okay, so those things can make for very, very powerful personal stories. Unfortunately, it is not uncommon for people to deal with sports injuries, and so it is one of the things that, again, you want to bring it back to less worrying about is it unique and more worrying about is it authentic to you. Similarly, when it comes to worrying about alienating somebody, if you're sharing who you are, and you're sharing what's important to you and somebody else is alienated by that, then maybe that wasn't the best fit for you anyway. That would be sort of a meta statement about it. It is a good idea to think about how you're phrasing things, though. So if you are talking about things that might be potentially controversial, sharing your opinion is fine as long as you are owning it as your own opinion. So making statements, particularly derogatory statements, are probably not going to fly real well, even if somebody happens to agree with you. Hopefully that's self-evident, but that's really the only place where things like religion, politics, those kinds of things come up. But as somebody who's been reading applications for a long time, I've read really great applications about politics, about religions, about sports injuries, all different kinds of things. So I would say nothing's off the table within reason. There are stories, but in general, anything is wide open so long as, again, it's authentic to you, and you're thinking about the ways in which it communicates your story. So letters of recommendation. So the common application, which close to 1,000 schools across the country are now using, will usually ask you for 2 teachers, as well as the letter that will come from your counselor. So biggest thing with recommendations is, again, I know this is getting a little tired at this point, but this is about your story. So it's about filling in more about who you are. So oftentimes people think about letters of recommendation more as endorsements. So somebody who's going to say, "Oh, this person would make a really great Harvard student," or this person would make a really great Georgetown student. It's less that, and it's more about telling us, again, something about yourself. So when you're thinking about, obviously, you can't control what goes into your recommendation letters. What you can control is who you're asking to write them and when. So thinking about who you want to ask to write your letters, think about people who know you well. It's one of the most important things. So oftentimes people want the person who got the best grade or the best known teacher at their school, or maybe even someone who's an alum of that institution, whatever. So if that person is willing to write a recommendation for you, but they don't really know anything about you, that's fine, but it doesn't really move your application forward. What moves your application forward is the people who can say something that's really meaningful about you and your experiences. That might be somebody that's watched you struggle. That might be a class where you got a C instead of an A. That might be someone who knows difficult times that you've had. Or that might be somebody who just recognizes how well you work with your peers and the fact that you're the one that hangs back after class and makes sure that the student, who was not understanding things quite as well is catching up okay. Those are the kinds of things that really make a difference with recommendations. So it's less about the subjects they teach, it's less about any sort of assumed prestige, things like that, and it's more about, again, completing those pieces of your story. So with most aspects of the college process, recommendations in particular, more is not better automatically. So most applications will allow you to submit what they call supplemental recommendations. So outside of those 2 teacher recommendations and your counselor recommendation, you can submit additional ones. Some people go really crazy with that, and they'll get 5 more teachers to write for them, and they'll get 3 other people from the community to write for them. Doesn't ultimately work to your advantage. 7 teachers telling us you're awesome, it's really no different than 2 teachers telling us you're awesome. It's really about learning how you're awesome. So supplemental recommendations can be really helpful in areas like if you're really involved with a faith community, if you have a part-time job, maybe you want a coach to write for you, maybe you have an elder in your community that you want to write for you. Those are the kinds of things that can help fill in other parts of your story and other parts of who you are, but just throwing a bunch more recommendations doesn't inflate the application. So quality over quantity. So what does happen when you click submit? So I'll be honest with you, 150 years ago when I applied to undergrad, I had no idea, I never even thought about who was on the other end of this process. This was back in the dark ages when you actually put a stamp on things, dropped in the stamps are little stickers that you used to put on people, never mind. So you used to have to mail these things in. I sent off all my college applications, didn't give it much thought after that. I think vaguely in the back of my head, I imagined people in white wigs and black robes in the basement of some building deciding the fate of America's teenagers. But I really didn't think about this as a human process. And ultimately, that's what this is. There's other people, there's other real live beings on the other end of this process who are trying to get to know you. And ultimately, we are your applicants, or we are your advocates, excuse me. You're the applicant. We're your advocates. So we're really trying to find what we call the reason to admit. So oftentimes I think people assume, again, kind of busting some of those myths, that, oh my gosh, with these single digit acceptance rates that some of these institutions have, you must just be combing through these applications and trying to find any possible little thing to push somebody out. And you misspelled supercalifragilisticexpialidocious, not at my school. The reality is we're looking in your application for what is it that helps push things forward. So we're looking for that reason to admit. Your application really does get read. Again, everything depends. Different schools work in different ways. Different schools work different ways every year. And your application gets routed after it's read. Ultimately, usually, most admissions offices are doing some version of a committee process, and there's a dean or somebody at the high end of the office who's going to ultimately kind of make some of the final decisions, or at least put their signature on this. So there's a few tough realities in all of this that I don't want to sugarcoat, particularly if you are thinking about any of the selective or highly selective schools. There's a reason they're called highly selective. Most of the students applying to a highly selective school don't get in. I don't say that to be dissuasive. I don't say that to be depressing, but that's simply the reality. And my own goddaughters went through this process very recently, and I got a text one day from one of my best friends, who is my goddaughter's mother, and she was sitting in the middle of an info session, and she said, I just realized something. When you say you guys have a 10% acceptance rate, that means 90% don't get in, right? And I was like, that's exactly what that means. And so oftentimes people know the numbers, but it doesn't really sink in. And so, yeah, that's the reason that these are called highly selective institutions. So it is important to understand that, you're entering into a very, very selective, very competitive process. And the toughest thing about this, and again, I'll explain why I'm sharing this, is that there's a lot of this process that's outside of your control. And that's very frustrating on one level, because I think we always want to think there's something that I can do that's going to push my application to the top of the pile. There's something I can run a little harder, I can work a little harder, I can get a little better, something that I can do that's going to push that forward. So this process is very, very largely about individual merit, but there's a point at which this also becomes about building a community. So when you talk about highly selective institutions, you're talking about places where we just, again, have far more really competitive applicants than we have room for. And so we have to start thinking about, where are people from? What are their interests? What are their backgrounds? What are some of the things that they're going to bring to campus? And those aren't things that you can control. So on the one hand, it can be very frustrating, but I also hope in some ways it's very liberating, because your responsibility is to do a good job on your application, to be authentic, to do these things that we've talked about. And after that, you let the process run its course. And I'll come back to that in a moment when I talk about my tips for a sane college search process. And so a lot of times this is not about being the most qualified or even being the best. So the most common question that we get after this process is, what could I have done to make my application better? Or why didn't I get in? And the reality, in most cases, is nothing. There's absolutely nothing that was wanting in somebody's application. It wasn't because you weren't good enough. It wasn't because you didn't work hard enough or anything else, simply the press of numbers. And so, again, this is about being authentic, being yourself, telling that story, and then understanding that there are going to be parts of the process that are outside of your control. But there is never any malice in this process. It is never about, it breaks my heart every time I hear somebody say, oh, I guess I wasn't good enough for whatever school, because that's simply not the case. We really get our hearts broken every year. The process is not about us, it's about you. But there are so many students that we advocate for that ultimately don't get in, and it doesn't mean it wasn't because somebody was really pulling for you. So, as I say, there are human beings on the other end of this process. There's real life people who are working as your advocates. You will often hear the joke, we are admissions officers, not denial officers. So we really do try to make that case for you. And we are trying to go to bat for you. So this is not a process of judgment or about anything that's missing. So there's three things that I want to share just to sort of wrap things up that hopefully will help you maintain a sane search process I'm sure you're going to hear this from your counselors as well. And please listen to your counselors. They know what they're doing. You've got some of the best in the business here. So they can be absolutely wonderful guides through this whole process as well. So hopefully this is just reinforcing things that you already know. But first and probably foremost is I really, 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 really encourage people to focus on a list of schools, not just your one top choice. So it's very hard not to have a top choice. In many ways, we want you to have a top choice. That's great. But thinking about that list, thinking about managing kind of a group of schools that you're interested in, that you're researching, that you're finding out, all those fit factors that we talked about in the beginning, places that are really a good match for you, that's really going to preserve your sanity through this with one key point. Make sure on that list there is at least one school that you know you can get into, that you know you can afford, that that's the only school you get into, you're going to be happy going there. As long as you have that school on your list, everything else gets real smooth real fast, okay? If your one and only choice, the entire college search process is Stanford or nothing, 96% of you are going to be really disappointed, okay? So having that list, having at least one core school in there that you're going to be happy at, that you know is accessible for you is great. After that, look at whatever the other options might be. Applying to more highly selective schools does not statistically improve your advantage of getting in. It is not a guarantee. You know, there's stories that you can get into one school and not another, even though that other school might be less selective than the other and all this kind of stuff. But the solution to the process is not just applying to more schools. It's one of the things when you kind of zoom out that has actually made this process progressively more crazy every year. So a lot of people think, oh, well, these schools are more selective, so I'll apply to more schools. And there are students out there who are applying to, I talked to a counselor that had a student last year that applied to 42 different colleges and universities. That's crazy. You're not doing yourself any favors with that. First of all, you're going to go broke on application fees. And second of all, what happens when you get into 37 of them? You haven't narrowed down your list at all. So focus on that list, get a reasonable number of schools, one in there that's a good guarantee that you're happy with. Everything's good. Be yourself, be authentic, use this process to tell us your story, and give yourself time to do the application well, okay? As long as you do that, your application is going to be great. It's going to be a great vehicle for you. It's going to speak for you. And then the last thing, press submit and let it go. Where people drive themselves insane is when you're trying to micromanage every last little thing. And they're thinking about, oh, well, if I take the SATs again and I go up 10 points, that's going to improve my chances. Or, oh, I read on Reddit that if you do this, then I can do. All that micro stuff is not what makes the difference in the process. It's about the story. It's about yourself. It's about the authenticity. So you can drive yourself crazy with the afterthoughts or the changes or all the micro stuff that isn't ultimately going to affect this process. So those are the three things: your list, give yourself time to do a good job, to do justice to your story, essentially, and let it go and let the process work for you. And that ultimately is going to yield some good results. Does it mean that you're going to get into Princeton? Not necessarily, but you're going to maximize your chances, and ultimately you're going to end up with at least some choices that you're really, really happy with. So those are the three things that I would share from our side of the desk that would be, really help to try to keep this process manageable for you. With that said, happy to take a little bit of time for questions or more detailed information or anything counselors want to jump in on, but I hope this information has been helpful for you. Like I say, I know that there is a lot of static out there and a lot of different people telling you a whole lot of different things. And it's amazing how many people know how to get into Harvard. There's even people who will charge you money to tell you how to get into Harvard. And the reality is that, I get in my feed every morning literally at least 2 or 3 different articles that are always kind of gotcha articles. And they're like, oh, what Ivy League admissions officers don't want you to know. And I'm like, that's interesting. I wonder what I don't want people to know. And we will read through these and we will sort of roll our eyes and smile and wish our lives were actually that interesting. But the process is, for as crazy as it is and as intimidating as it is actually fairly straightforward. The things that we say we value, we value. The things that we encourage people to do, we really encourage you to do. The way the way that we say we review applications is actually the way that we review them. So so hopefully that pulls, like I say, pulls the curtain back a little bit on some of this process. Maybe your stress level goes down 6 or 7%. But this is an enjoyable process in a way. It's thinking about your future. The good news, and one of the happiest things I will share with you, is that according to national polls, somewhere in the neighborhood of 95% of students, once they get to their undergraduate institution of choice, are either happy or very happy with the institution that they chose. So as long as you are kind of spending a little bit of time thinking about this process, being conscious, being deliberate, you're going to be fine wherever you end up, and you're going to get a great experience. So I really wish you guys well with this process. I hope this has been helpful, and happy to take questions, comments, rebuttals, emotional outbursts, any of that kind of thing. Yeah, in the back. Sure. So again, different schools just about every school, I think every school in the country went test optional as a result of the pandemic because it simply wasn't safe and the testing centers weren't open. So some schools are back to requiring testing. Some schools are remaining test optional, period. There are essentially 4 testing policies. There's test blind, which means even if you send test scores, they won't look at them. There's test optional, which leaves it up to you whether or not you want to submit your test scores. There's testing required, which is testing required. And then there is actually a fairly new policy that I believe only 2 or 3 schools in the country are doing called no harm testing, which is that you can submit testing, but they will only consider it if it advances your application, not if it hurts it or creates a critical evaluation. So vast majority of schools are either in those first 3. So as far as the difference between the SAT and the ACT, the 2 testing organizations and the 2 actual tests have gotten closer and closer over the years. So there used to be kind of a whole different strategy between the SAT and the ACT. One would often cater to different learning styles in better ways. They're honestly so much in competition with each other that they've actually gotten very, very close. So very few schools, I don't think there's too many that require one or the other. I think it's pretty wide open. For us, there's absolutely no differentiation between the 2. It's entirely up to you which you want to submit. You can submit both if you want to. Testing is an interesting topic. We actually made the resoundingly popular decision to go back to requiring testing. We secretly knew that this is everyone's favorite part of the application process. Didn't want to deny that to people anymore. So what we found, and every institution is going to be different. What we found at Dartmouth was in looking at our applicant pool during the years that we went test optional, we found that most often the students who were going to benefit the most from submitting their scores were actually the ones that were withholding their scores. So oftentimes people will look at averages and they'll say, oh, my score isn't that, so I feel like this is going to reflect badly on me if I submit my score. Well, our institutional average is something ridiculously high. I think it's a 32 or a 33. But your 26 might be a really, really strong score based on who you are and where you're coming from. So again, it's always about context. It's always about looking at you and grounding you and where you're coming from and what the, what the norms might be for your area, your school, all those different kinds of things. And so, and the other thing too, which skews the conversation a little bit, is that for schools that are test optional, when they report their averages, they automatically get inflated because it's only the students who are choosing to submit their scores. And so that becomes even more intimidating, and it turns into a little bit of a spiral or catch-22. So anyway, in terms of testing, we know full well it does not tell us how smart you are. It doesn't tell us how well you're going to do in college. It certainly doesn't tell us what kind of person you are. but it is a metric that gives a little bit of a backstop to academic information. So it's part of that overall academic profile. We know some people are better test takers than others. People have access to different levels of preparation, all those different kinds of things. So I always say there is absolutely nothing standard about standardized testing, but it is something that we chose to go back to. So, yeah. Yeah, it depends. So, so great question. And basically, the NCAA has pretty strict regulations for how athletic recruitment works. So they work off what's called an academic index, which is basically a number, an evaluative number that is determined by the school. And so there is basically a pre-read process that goes on with the coaches are aware of the students' academic performance, and then we have liaisons. This is just for our process, but we have liaisons within the admissions office that work with each team. So basically, by the time someone gets to an actual recruitment slot, they've been pre-vetted to the point where they are, we know they're going to be academically prepared to come to Dartmouth, and then the process goes on from there. So they still submit the same application materials as everyone else, still go through the same process, but they have been pre-vetted, and those coaches' recommendations take on pretty significant weight so long as they've already gone through the NCAA process. But there's some pretty strict regulations about where the admissions office's role takes place in terms of actual athletic recruitment. So the recruitment process takes place through the coaches, and then the admissions process comes through our office with everyone else. Does that answer your question? Okay, great. Yeah. So our overall admissions officer, we are about 26, 27 different admissions officers. My role as coordinator of Indigenous outreach is a little bit unique. So I have my regular territories, including Hawai'i here. And then I also oversee our Native and Indigenous outreach as part of that. So I'm the only one that actually has a specific community role in that sense. We do have folks that work with our rural outreach as well. But Dartmouth was actually founded originally as an institution to serve Native students, and they did a phenomenally terrible job of that for about 200 years, and then came back to it in 1970. So part of the recommitment that the institution went through was actually the initial part of the recommitment came through the admissions office. So this position has actually been part of our admissions team for a number of years now, so that's one of the reasons that I have this kind of dual role, but that's not necessarily true across all different communities. So all of my colleagues are still involved in Native and Indigenous outreach, and we all read for different students in different communities. But this one is just a little unique given the charter of our institution. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and I actually didn't mention in the beginning, but I am also the living advisor for one of our living learning communities on campus. So I do actually live right on campus with a bunch of 18 and 19-year-olds. So it's one of the things that keeps me so wonderfully immature. And so, yeah. Other questions? Yeah. Great question. So it depends a little bit on the process. I say it without even realizing it sometimes. So early decision is a November 1st deadline, and we notify students by the middle of December. So for early decision, we are an early decision school, not early action. So it is essentially a binding commitment that students enter into. So essentially, if you were admitted in December, we expect that you would remove any other applications you have out there. So that's about a 6-week turnaround. And then the majority of our applications come in through regular decision process. That's a January 2nd deadline, and students are notified at the end of March. So that's usually about a 3-month process. So again, different schools work in all different ways, everything from rolling admissions. Some schools have multiple early rounds that people can do. They have early action, which is a non-binding version of the early process, all different kinds of cycles and things like that. Some schools basically, as soon as you submit the application, they review it and give you an answer. Those are the rolling schools. But the majority of our peers are in that kind of, here's a deadline, and then we notify folks at the end of March. May 1st is basically known as the universal deadline to notify schools. So that's why most schools will notify students at the end of March, and you'll have a month to kind of explore options and visit campuses and things like that if you have the opportunity to do that. Yeah. Mm. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. It's a great question. And again, it will depend somewhat on different institutions, but I think the majority of institutions now welcome students doing gap years, sometimes multiple years. So it really is certainly something that has changed a lot over time, and multiple different paths that people can pursue for that too. Sometimes people want to apply while they're still in high school, still have access to the teachers, the counselors, that kind of thing. And then most institutions, including ours, will offer a deferment. So basically, you're admitted to the class of 2029. I'd like to take a gap year and explore, get an internship, travel, watch Netflix, whatever. And so you can defer and enter. Usually they'll give at least 1 year, some schools 2. It also depends on what it is for. So sometimes people, if they have like mandatory military service or church obligations, things like that, they can extend it beyond that. But we welcome gap years, and whether students wait and apply after they've done some time off, or whether they apply and then defer, that's much more a personal decision. But I think gap years are absolutely welcomed now in a way that they wouldn't have been a while back. But to see the kind of growth, to see the opportunity for a lot of students, it really gives them a richer opportunity to take full advantage of college when they get there. Again, bringing different voices, different stories, all that different kind of stuff. So the only place that I see where students occasionally do have difficulty is if they are out for multiple years, then just getting some of the information that they need still to apply as a first-year student, going back to their high school can be a little bit more challenging. So sometimes at least making sure you have recommenders and other things, your transcript and that kind of stuff can be helpful if you are anticipating taking a longer time between high school and college. But other than that, the gap year can be a great way to go. Yeah. So we're really trying to build as diverse a community as we can. So it's really about, again, people with different worldviews, different experiences, all those different kinds of things. So as I mentioned, with the types of classes and the type of class formats that we have at Dartmouth, probably very similar to a lot of the classes that you guys are used to here. It's going to be a very small environment. It's really going to be about professors asking you your opinions on things, asking you to share different experiences, information, all that different kind of stuff. And that's really just in the classroom. One of the things that faculty always hate but will grudgingly admit is that some of the most important learning experiences you get are not necessarily going to be in the classroom. That's one of the things that makes some of these places so powerful, is that it will be the conversations that you have sitting in a stairwell at 1 o'clock in the morning eating pizza with some of your friends, or conversations you have in a locker room with some of your teammates, or whatever it might be. So really, just bringing together as many different kinds of people as possible is the goal. And always with the understanding that these are students who have done well, who are passionate about what they do. I would say for us, we also tend to look for students who are relatively self-directed. So Dartmouth is a place with a lot of freedom and a lot of choices and a lot of flexibility. So some schools are very prescriptive. If you come in as a pre-med student, you're going to do this your freshman year, you're going to do this your sophomore year, et cetera, et cetera. And that's great. It works very, very well for a lot of people. Our school is very different. It's very self-directed. There's a lot of freedom and flexibility both in the academic calendar as well as with the academic curriculum. And so we really like to see people who are going to be able to chart their own course and follow their own passions that way. But overall, it's really just about bringing different voices to the table. Yeah. Oh, yes, please. Mhm. Yeah, great question, and it depends. So for different institutions work very, very differently on this. Some schools, you're going to apply to a particular school, a particular program, and it can often be very difficult to change that along the way. So, if you start off in an engineering program or a nursing program to back out and start with another major program, sometimes it means losing a lot of credits. Sometimes it means an entirely new application process, all different kinds of things. A lot of schools will give you much more flexibility and much more freedom that way. I can tell you the way it works at Dartmouth, which is that when you apply to Dartmouth, you simply apply to the college. You're not applying to any particular major or program. The Common Application and QuestBridge both give you the option to list up to 3 areas of academic interest that you have. Those are completely non-binding. Depending on the year, depending on whose data you believe, anywhere from 50 to 75% of college students change their mind after they get into college about what they think they want to study. So we've always tried to maintain a lot of flexibility about that. So students enter and they can start taking classes, whatever sounds interesting to them. We don't have general education or core requirements. We do have what we call distributive requirements that can go over the course of 4 years, but it's not, you start off taking like general ed or that kind of thing. You can dive right into whatever you're interested in right away. And then students will usually declare a major in sophomore year. For us, it's still very, very easy to change after that. So I actually know 2 seniors last year who changed their major in their senior year, which I do not recommend as a strategy, but they were able to do. So essentially, as long as you have enough time to complete whatever the requirements are for a major, you can change things as late as you want. So with our institution, it's basically it's very much a choose your own adventure. So as I was saying, it's a very self-directed process. So you might come in thinking, I want to be pre-med and I'm going to be a biology major, and you get to that first biology lab and decide that fainting at the sight of blood is not necessarily going to be a great option for a doctor. So or it might just simply be, no matter how great your high school is, there are so many different disciplines and so many different areas available to you in college and university that you may never even heard of. And so somebody comes along and says, well, I was really interested in pre-med, but I've never even heard of medical anthropology, and medical anthropology seems really cool, and that's what I want to do now. And then by the time you graduate, you're doing medical anthropology modified with women's and gender studies with a minor in Spanish and a study abroad program in Brazil. That's a pretty common thing. And that's true at a lot of different institutions. So I often use my father as an example. So my dad was an American history major as an undergraduate. He went on and got a master's degree in chemical engineering and became a graphic designer. So perfectly logical trajectory. But different schools are going to work different ways. With Dartmouth, super, super flexible. Literally, if you want to change majors, you go talk to your advising dean, fill out a form, and that's all there is to it. But yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, great question. And again, it will depend a little bit from thing to thing. Obviously, there are more common areas, and it's not necessarily anything that works against people. If we do see people with a really compelling interest in something that is more unusual, that can actually be something that plays a part in what we look at. But it's really about an actual compelling or demonstrated interest, not just which box did you check, because again, there's a lot of strategery that goes into it for some students, and it's like, oh, well, lots of people want to do economics, so I'm going to say digital animation, and Oh, if you don't know, no, not at all. And I mean, we often joke, as a lot of institutions do, that undecided is our most popular major. So a lot of our students come in having put undecided for all three areas of academic interest. Sometimes they'll put that as number one, and maybe a couple of things that they think they're interested in. So that kind of thing is wide open, and it does not impact a student negatively if they don't know what they want to do. Because again, we anticipate that over half of the students are going to change their mind anyway. So. Yeah. Thank you very much for all your